Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hashing Out the Law. I'm your host, Hashemi. Today, my guest is Tristan Stewart-Robertson. Tristan is a reporter. He has his own podcast. It's all about crime, but I'm not gonna go into it. I'm gonna let Tristan go into it. Tristan, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being on. I'm actually very excited. I know you started as a reporter. Tell us how you started as a reporter, and then take us down the path which led you to your podcast and then the case that you started following. And just I want the audience to hear your fascinating story, please.
Well, I should obviously address the fact that although I am in Scotland, I clearly do not sound very Scottish. I am Canadian. I'm from the New Brunswick in Canada, but I've been living and working in Scotland for more than 20 years. So I came over to study journalism in the UK. I wanted to work in Scotland, got a job at a local paper up here, and I've been working here ever since. So it was working on local papers. I was at the Greenock Telegraph back in 2007, and I've been doing court reporting my entire career as part of being a general reporter. So you cover anything that you are sent on. But while I was in Greenock, a fax came in from, we still had faxes, a fax came in from a court agency down south about a case that I wasn't familiar with. And it was this guy who was fighting extradition back to the US after being accused of murder in Florida. And so I sort of took a vague interest at that point. I contacted, made contact with the mom of the victim in Florida around that time, so February 2007. Um, and then I just kept following the case, and very little actually happened. We might get an update once a year. I might speak to the mom once a year, and then it kind of gradually increased in terms of frequency. And I'm skipping quite a few steps in the legal process, but eventually it got to the European Court of Human Rights twice. Second time was in uh, early 2017, and it was speaking to the mom that night after the hearing, and that she started t telling me much more about the case than I was familiar with. And that started me down the road of what can I do with this? This isn't going to be a simple news report. There's actually a lot more here. And then I started looking into it in more depth, and that's when I really discovered how much I could get from the US and from particularly Florida public records laws. Um, because I should say in Scotland we have very little access to things. So there are rules certainly when somebody is arrested, when somebody is charged, we can't report anything other than what is said in court. There's no commentary on the side. There's nothing like that at all. You could not comment on a case until there was a conviction or the end of a court process if they were cleared. Um, but in terms of accessing court documents, that's almost impossible. So there is a court roll that comes out that covers the 7 subsequent days, and then it disappears. There is a media portal that gives me the upcoming 7 days, but only a little bit more information. And it's the state that determines if you are a legitimate journalist that should have access to this. But otherwise, you need to physically be in court to see something happened. So, in terms of what I had access to, nothing in Scotland, but I had thousands of pages that I ultimately got from Florida.
Now, Scott, I don't want to interrupt you, but I am. So you said something interesting. The access that we have into the court system in America, in the US, is actually pretty much open. And a lot of people don't know this. And you found out yourself how open everything is. Yeah, you do have to go through certain process and steps, but
Mhm.
eventually, if it's public record, you'll get your hands on it. They're not trying to hide anything from you. Yes, some stuff might be sealed or classified, but overall, especially a reporter, you can have access to the case if you want. A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah. I have never seen a court transcript in the UK apart from bits of one from an appeal, maybe. That's it. That's all I've ever seen. I cannot see evidence. If, for example, so let's say somebody has pleaded guilty to something, then there's an agreed narrative between defense and prosecution, and that gets read out by the prosecution. If, however, the prosecution hands a written copy of that narrative to the sheriff at this level, so it's judge, but sheriff, called a sheriff, um, I can't see that unless it has been read out in court.
Wow.
So there are cases, and I have challenged the Crown Office on this. Are you really protecting, for example, a domestic abuser, so we can't see what they actually did because it wasn't read out in open court? And that it's an astonishing level of inbuilt secrecy, really, to it. Um, so I will explain what the podcast is called A Murder Without End. And the basic story is Philip Harkins killed somebody in Florida in 1999. He fled to Scotland, killed somebody else with dangerous driving, then fought extradition. It became one of Britain's longest running extradition battles. And then he was finally sent back to Florida. And so I have 0 pages from Scotland. I have thousands from Florida. And Florida revealed what was going on, the communication between the U.S. Department of State, Florida prosecutors, and the Home Office in the UK. Whereas I would never get that in the UK. So the podcast and the entire story, all the reporting, is only possible thanks to Florida's transparency and nothing to do with the UK, despite the fact that I'm here.
Wow. By the way, you've been there for 20 years and there's no Scottish accent there, but you still have a hint of Canadian accent on certain words when you say it. So
Well, apparently I sound Irish on the phone. I don't know why. But I've been told that somebody called the other week and said, "Oh, I was looking for the Canadian." No, that's me. Oh, I thought you sounded Irish. Okay.
so let's go back to this case. You talked about it, or you briefly touched upon it. He was charged with murder in Florida, went to Scotland, killed someone else because of his driving. He was
Yeah.
extradited. How long between 1999 when he committed the murder in Florida until he was finally extradited back to the US?
He was extradited in the summer of 2017, and the whole case was finished without giving too much away about the ending in 2018. So nearly 20 years.
Okay. And then your
Um,
podcast talks about the case. So if I want to learn about the case, or if anybody wants to learn about the case, your podcast is the place to go, correct?
it covers absolutely everything. There's the only bits that I have left out are bits that I couldn't 100% corroborate.
Now, let me ask you,
It,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, no, sorry.
I was going to say, let me ask you, what interested you in this case? I know you talked about how you communicated with the mother and it was the longest extradition case in UK history. But what was it that made you interested in it where you said, you know what, this is a case that I'm going to follow?
I think a lot of it was driven by the mom of the victim. So Patricia, that's the you would hear the name a lot in the podcast. Because I have a lot of conversations with Patricia and I recorded it as we went, not initially knowing that I was going to be doing a podcast on it. Um, and I think local journalism focuses quite heavily on speaking to survivors, the family of victims, particularly in Scotland, where we can't report on a case until it's finished. The thing that we can report is the survivors, those left behind, the families, and their grief. And I have said that actually, reporters, I think one of the things that we do is we study grief. We can't express what grief is. It's a very intangible thing to try to describe what somebody feels. But our job is to ask questions of a person who's grieving and ask, what did that person mean to you? What are you feeling right now? How are you processing that kind of thing? And so my journey with Patricia, which is reflected as much as possible in the podcast, is what journey she's going on in terms of loss and processing it. Because for many years, she was searching Google every day for any updates on the case. And she had actually found out that the decision from the European Court was going to be the next day. And she tried frantically to reach me that weekend, and I just missed the email from her. And she eventually called because she needed to get through to me because I was the only person that she trusted. I was the only person feeding her information. And that's actually happened before with local cases. And there was a rape survivor who was messaging me throughout the trial because victim support was not giving her answers. She wasn't being told how the process would go. And so she was trying to ask me, well, what should I make of this? What's going to happen next? And so there's a degree of reporting, particularly local reporting, that is kind of hand-holding. There's a studying of the grief. And I think that's how we connect to cases so much is you can either connect to a true crime case by focusing on the psychology of the killer, for example, or what's gone through their mind. But I'm interested in the people who are not in prison, so and what they are going through and how they are experiencing things. And so there's those two sides of reporting where you're watching a justice system, you're seeing whether justice is done, but you are sitting with, maybe not immediately next to you, but you're sitting with the families who are also watching for that justice.
So the lens that you view these cases through is how the specific crime has affected those uh, outside of the crime, the victim's family or any bystanders and things like that. That's the lens that you view crimes in.
Uh, It's how I view this one through. I should say on a day-to-day level, I sat in court on Tuesday, my local court. Is Tuesday is my regular day. We don't have enough reporters to go any other day of the week, and I can only cover one out of many cases, or one courtroom out of various ones. But you are churning through 40 cases in a day. So you're operating more on volume rather than on quality. So you can't really, certainly I can't get any background to the cases. There's certainly no victims who weren't attending court in those days. You're really just reporting the basics of what is happening in the courtroom. So the day-to-day job of reporting court here is limited to that, but there are cases when, victims might approach you or you might approach a family and you build that connection. It's definitely not an immediate thing. It's a slow process to, quite rightly, to earn trust. Um, I'm not going to pretend that there are, 100% good reporters,
Right.
100% ethical, you know, legal in some cases, but it does require building trust. That's a slow process. And I think Patricia and I took a lot of it took a lot of years to build up that trust.
How did you
Um,
connect with Patricia the first time? Did she reach out to you? Did you reach out to her? What was the
I
circumstance?
think I found her number in the white pages online. So I was very, very lucky that I found a number and I called her. And she didn't, she had been told by the US State Department not to speak to reporters because it might affect the case. That wasn't, that isn't true. It couldn't have influenced that kind of court case. Um, but that's what she was told. But she was still, amenable to making that connection. So it was a very, because I didn't have any information initially, I was reaching out to ask how she felt about the case. But when nothing is happening, I mean, there were 2 years sometimes between appeals getting heard. So it's a very slow, grinding process. I mean, the extradition process of this story is about 14 years.
Wow. Let me ask you
So
this.
he was in prison awaiting extradition for 14 years.
Let me ask you this. What was he fighting extradition about? What was his reasoning that he's going to not get a fair trial without giving away too much of the podcast?
No, I mean it was a he kept changing. He changed a few times his tact. ultimately what he got to the European Court on was under the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 3, which is the prohibition on torture or cruel and inhuman practices, or sorry, cruel or inhuman punishment. So he was arguing that life without parole. So you can't extradite somebody to face the death penalty. That's been clear in Europe and the UK for a long time. But so Florida had agreed not to seek the death penalty. But he argued that life without parole was inhuman. So that's the principal one that he fought on. He then argued that Article 6, the right to a fair trial, that he couldn't get a fair trial because the potential sentence had already been set. So because he would, if convicted, face a mandatory life without parole, then he couldn't get a fair trial. I mean, that was a sort of a secondary one. It wasn't very convincing. Um, but ultimately, his lawyers argued that it was the gun had gone off accidentally, and so therefore it was akin to manslaughter, not first degree murder, and he would be life without parole was inhuman because it was too much of a punishment for something that was an accidental killing. If he was there, they also argued that he wasn't there, but if he was there, it was an accident, which I found at least as a listener, because you could listen into the European case, um, a strange argument. Well, I didn't do it, I wasn't there, but if I was, it was an accident, which is an interesting argument.
So that's what I find interesting is this is the European court you were talking about.
Yeah.
He was fighting the facts on an extradition hearing rather than the procedure or the ultimate punishment. I mean, he was fighting the ultimate punishment as well, but you're saying he was also fighting the facts. That's something that the European courts do for extradition.
No, and that was actually, I mean, he had lost at every stage because he kept trying to bring in facts, and the court said this is not relevant. The only question, at least in the this is a very niche aspect of it. Technically, he was processed under the older extradition treaty between the UK and the US, but it's a small point. But anyway, um, he just has to show, or the US and by proxy the UK state has to show that there is a prima facie case. Is there a case to answer?
Right.
That's all they have to show. So there was a case to answer in Florida, whether he was innocent or not. There was a case to answer, and so therefore, what are the merits of that? And that threshold was met quite easily. He then argued, well, actually, I shouldn't be sent because it would impinge on my human rights.
And that took about 14 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, there are a lot of reasons, and some of the twists of that are covered in the podcast. I mean, I go into far too much detail probably, but and I had to dumb down one of the episodes at least twice. I rewrote it a couple times because it was, I'm not going to pretend, human rights legislation and is quite dense, and I also had to explain UK terminology and law to an international audience, and then Florida terminology back to the UK. So
No,
there's the UK system, there's the US system, and then there's the European system. So there's sort of three clashing law systems that I'm covering and having to explain to people as hopefully best as I can.
that's interesting. I want to talk about that, but before we talk about that, again, what is the name of your podcast and where can I listen to it?
A Murder Without End, and it is available anywhere and everywhere. So on all major streaming platforms, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, YouTube, it is everywhere. So
And for
and
all
I
the
should and I should say I'm pleased to say it's a double award winning. We won the silver and listener's choice at the Signal Awards last year. So pleased that the 5 years of work every most evenings and weekends on the side of the day job did pay off.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thank
For
you.
all the viewers and the listeners, we're going to include the links to the podcast in the comment section and in the detailed section so you guys can just click on it, listen to Tristan's podcast. Now, Tristan, let's go back to you were talking about there was three different law systems working in this case. You had the Florida system, you had the UK system, and you had the European system. Now, I know that you were very familiar with the UK system because you were reporting it for a long time. Were you as familiar with the European system? And I'm not going to say the Florida system. I'm guessing you had no clue what's going on in Florida until you got in this case.
I didn't have a clue what was going on in Florida. I have to say it was uh, an immense joy to discover how easily I could access things. So this was Jacksonville, so this is Duval County, and Duval County, their online portal gives me access to 30 years of records, which is, just the minute by minute, not minute by minute, but the line by line case docket is an immense thing to be able to piece together what's happening. And not just of him, but of the accused killer, but of witnesses and things like that. The European system is overarching. So the European Court of Human Rights is built into domestic UK legislation through the Human Rights Act. So when he's going through UK courts, it's an aspect, but it's applied through the Human Rights Act. You can then apply to the European Court if you can argue that there is a potential breach of your human rights. So it's a third system, but it's sort of maybe to the side a little bit.
Right. So,
Um,
do you think you can actually teach a class on how the UK system or the European system works for novice people?
I certainly hope that I would be able to um, explain what happened in these cases, and the aspects of these cases, because there are some fine specifics. As I said, there's Article 3, the right to the prohibition on inhuman punishment, the right to a fair trial. Those are key aspects of this case. And in Florida, the key aspect is the 175-day rule. So when was he actually arrested? And was the indictment, was the grand jury um, indictment handed down? Was prosecution, done within the 175 days? That was a recurring appeal on the Florida side for pretty much the entire length of the case. Um, I Yeah, I go into a few specifics on that one as well in the podcast.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
want to I don't want to give away the podcast, so I'm not gonna I'm gonna try to ask you general questions.
that's
I'm
all
gonna
right.
ask you now. Again, for the viewers and listeners, the podcast is called A Murder Without End, where it follows a U.S. citizen who was wanted for murder in Florida, fled to the UK, fought extradition, and it took about 14 years for the extradition process to come to an end. He was extradited back to Florida. Tristan followed the case closely, and he talks about it. Everybody, please uh, listen to the podcast if you want to know more about it. It's actually very interesting. Now, Tristan, what was your favorite thing about the case in general and making the podcast? What was it that you enjoyed the most? Or let's start with that question because I got another question for you as well.
What did I enjoy the most about it? Finishing it. That was I released it all in one go rather than drip feeding it. I was a month, no, 2 months away from my getting married to my producer, actually, Liam. And so I had promised this will be done. This will be out of our out of our lives well before the wedding. It's fine. So finishing it was a great joy, but also um, being the podcast being welcomed by the two family members who listened to it. I know that not all of the so the victim's name was Josh. Not all of Josh's family have listened to it. They can't. I appreciate that. It is not easy to do. Patricia has lived and breathed this since day one. She can never let it go. And one of Josh's brothers listened to the whole thing in 2 days, I think. And he said he wanted more. I said, there's not more. I've told everything. Um, but that was a relief. And I think they were skeptical actually of the name at first. They weren't really sure about a murder without end. What does that say? But actually, once they listen to it, they agree entirely. Yes, it is a murder without end because for them, it has never stopped. And I think that's true of so many victims and people left behind. It's not the murder might have been 20 years ago, but it's right there. It's, like it was yesterday for a lot of people.
Right. Now, did this case, no, hold on. Before I ask this question, I want to know a little bit about how you ended up in Scotland, if you don't mind. How did you end up in Scotland and what made you decide to stay?
My joke is I didn't have enough money to leave. Um, my dad did his PhD at the University of Edinburgh in the 60s, and we had lived in Edinburgh for a month when I was 12, and I always thought I want to go back and try it again when I'm older. So I'd studied journalism down in Cardiff in Wales, and they had 100% job placement record, which most journalism schools do not have. Certainly not any in Canada. And so I got a job within 2 weeks. But it was minimum wage. I worked mostly 6, 7 days a week for years to get a student debt, and there's still no money to leave. Um, but also, I love some of the communities that I have reported on. What I usually describe about journalism is the best part. And there's a lot of difficult days, there's a lot of difficult bits to this job. But the best thing is I get to meet people and write about it.
That's
That
great. Now,
that's a great job.
so you actually lived in Scotland when you were younger.
Only for a month. So I,
For a
I
month?
I don't remember anything. I don't remember much other than being obsessed with tourist trinkets. Um, and some vague memories of visiting the odd castle. But Dad was always uh, he always felt a keen connection to Scotland, and so
Right.
I think part of it was a desire to see a bit of what he saw. Now, ultimately, actually, he had been on one side of the country, and Glasgow's on the other side, and Glasgow and Edinburgh are like chalk and cheese. They are very
Right.
different
I
cities.
actually I actually went to Scotland, and I was in Edinburgh, and then we took a train. We went to Glasgow we spent a day in Glasgow.
Mm,
But you were talking about Edinburgh University. That place is beautiful,
mm,
and for people who haven't been, they need to go. I heard that Harry Potter was the author was influenced by Edinburgh University. The architecture is just beautiful.
mm.
Edinburgh itself is just beautiful. But I could relate how you go to Scotland and not want to leave. I could relate to that.
I mean, uh, it is stormy. It is the joke is it rains and then there's winter and that's about it.
Yeah. It's
Um,
funny when I went there, we were there in September and we had all our rain gear ready. And when we got there, there was a heat wave. And
mm,
the whole time we were there, it was a heat wave and it was 70 degrees. And they were saying it's so hot. But to us, it wasn't that hot and it was beautiful. We were like, oh, we're lucky. We got this heat wave. No rain at all. But I hear it rains all the time.
Well, you know that in Scotland we have an expression when it is warm enough, when there's a hint of sun, somebody will pull their top off. And it's usually men who should not be taking their tops off, but it's called tapsaf, and that's my terrible attempt at Scottish, but tapsaf. So if it's sunny, it's going to be tapsaf somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. Again, um, A Murder Without End. It's available on every platform. We're going to include the links. Tristan, I appreciate you coming on. I know we are on completely different time zones. I appreciate you making the time to come on. I know it's rather late for you. Um, I, I'm gonna include the links for everybody. But before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to say about the podcast that you haven't said yet?
Just that I mean I welcome all listeners. There are links on the web page tomorrow.is to all the cases in detail if you want to get do a deep dive on the cases. And but ultimately it's about people, and I hope people appreciate the work. I certainly hope people support uh local journalism. I did this for free, and it well, not free, it costs a lot to do the work in my spare time and fly to Florida at one point and everything else. Support local journalism and watch courts. It's easy to watch courts on court TV, but what's going on at your local courts? What is justice being done? And that's a big lesson that I hope people take, because it is important to see what is happening in courts and how it's impacting people.
I agree. It was a pleasure having you on, Tristan.
Thank you so much.